For more than 100 years, humanity has been shouting into the dark without even realizing it. Every radio broadcast, every TV show, every radar ping has spilled out into the void, forming a bubble of noise around Earth that now stretches more than 100 light-years across. In that bubble, any civilization with the right technology could hear our earliest mistakes, our first songs, even our static-filled experiments. For decades, scientists comforted themselves with the idea that nobody was listening, that the silence of space meant we were alone. But what if that silence was never silence at all? What if someone out there has been waiting, patient, listening to every word we've ever sent, and finally decided to answer? It didn't start with a dramatic flash of light in the sky or flying saucers descending from the clouds. It started with something so small it could have been ignored, an object drifting through our solar system, moving too fast to belong here. Astronomers called it interstellar, a traveler from another star. But then came the detail that turned a curiosity into a revelation. A faint, deliberate signal radiating from the object, pulsing at a frequency so precise it could never be mistaken for nature. Numbers, patterns, a language built on the universal rhythm of mathematics. Someone was speaking and they weren't using chance to get our attention, they were targeting us. The world didn't react with calm. Governments scrambled, scientists argued, and billions of people looked up at the sky with a mix of awe and fear. Because if this was real and every test said it was, then the universe had just revealed something terrifying. We are not alone, and the first to break the silence are closer than we ever dared to imagine. When people think about humanity reaching for the stars, they imagine rockets cutting through the atmosphere, astronauts floating in orbit, or spacecraft like Voyager and Pioneer carrying golden records into the unknown. But the truth is, our first real messages to the universe weren't deliberate at all. They were accidents. From the moment we discovered how to harness radio waves, we began leaking ourselves into space, unintentionally announcing our existence to anyone who might be listening. Every song that played on the radio, every voice that delivered news across the airwaves, every radar system that scanned the skies for enemy bombers during World War II, it all escaped into the cosmos as invisible ripples of energy. We imagined these broadcasts belonged only to us, filling homes and theaters, but in reality, they were spilling into the vacuum, spreading outward in a growing bubble that now stretches well over 100 light-years from Earth. That bubble, known as the radio bubble, is a sphere of noise expanding at the speed of light, carrying with it the fingerprints of an entire species. Within its boundaries are the sounds of our triumphs and our tragedies, our science and our stupidity, our laughter and our lies. To an outsider, it would be a raw, unfiltered portrait of humanity, messy but unmistakably alive. At first, no one thought much of it. Radio was new, and the idea of alien civilizations listening in felt more like a fantasy than a scientific possibility. But as decades passed, the sheer scale of what we had unleashed became impossible to ignore. By the 1940s, our military radars were blasting signals so powerful they could outshine the sun at certain wavelengths. To us, they were defensive tools, protecting nations from unseen enemies. To the universe, they were sirens, flashing into the dark with a clarity no natural source could match. Every time we pointed radar into the sky, we weren't just scanning for threats on Earth. We were announcing our presence to the stars, and the broadcasts didn't stop there. The rise of television added another layer. Imagine an alien civilization with sensitive instruments, tuning into a faint flicker of signal carried across space. What would they see? Grainy images of black and white sitcoms, boxing matches, world leaders giving speeches, the first televised Olympics, even the horrors of global conflict, frozen in newsreels. The opening ceremonies of the 1936 Berlin Olympics, broadcast live, are now more than 85 light-years away, traveling through the cosmos as a permanent record of who we were. Every passing year adds another layer, another shell of transmissions leaving Earth, creating a time capsule that spreads farther and farther, carrying humanity's story long after the original moments were forgotten here. But not all of our transmissions were accidents. In time, we realized what we were doing and wondered if we could do it better. In 1974, from the massive Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico, humanity made its first deliberate attempt to say hello to the universe. The Arecibo message wasn't just noise, it was carefully constructed, a binary pattern containing information about our DNA, our solar system, even a sketch of a human being. a cosmic business card flung toward the stars, aimed at a cluster 25,000. It was a gesture of curiosity and hope, though everyone knew the odds were vanishingly small that anyone would ever read it. But that didn't matter. For the first time, we were speaking not to ourselves, but to someone else. Someone hypothetical, someone beyond. Yet the irony was that even as we tried to control the message, the uncontrolled flood of transmissions continued. The Pioneer plaques and Voyager golden records engraved with maps, sounds and music, meant to represent humanity, were carefully curated, polished versions of who we wanted to be. But the radio bubble remained the messy reality of who we actually were. Aliens wouldn't need to wait 25,000 years for the Arecibo message to arrive. If they were within 100 light years, they could already be listening, already piecing together fragments of our culture, our languages, our mistakes. They could be hearing the Beatles play on Ed Sullivan. They could be listening to a presidential address. They could even be listening to the raw static of an early experimenter trying to send a signal across town. And if they were listening, then they've known about us for decades, maybe longer. This is where the unsettling thought creeps in. For all of our scientific optimism, we never truly considered what it meant to be the noisy species in a universe that may value silence. If other civilizations exist, some might be cautious, hiding their presence, broadcasting nothing, leaving no trace. Others might have learned the dangers of shouting into the dark. We, on the other hand, never had that caution. We were children with a megaphone, blasting into the unknown with no thought for who might hear. And that raises a terrifying possibility. If someone has been listening, then they have had ample time to study us, to analyze our signals, to decode our patterns, to learn our languages. We thought we were alone, but perhaps we have been under observation longer than we realize. Still, there is something profoundly human about our accidental introduction to the universe. We didn't start by sending equations or diagrams. We started by sending stories, jokes, music, and mistakes. We sent pieces of our daily lives, unfiltered and unedited. If another species ever plays back our transmissions, they will hear the real us. Not the polished ambassadors on plaques or golden records, but the flawed, chaotic creatures who laugh, fight and dream. And perhaps in that raw honesty, we've given them something far more valuable than a carefully designed message. We've given them a glimpse of who we really are. But the story doesn't end with broadcasts slipping into the void. The question that lingers is whether anyone has answered. For decades, projects like SETI have scanned the skies, searching for signals that don't belong, signals that break the patterns of nature and hint at intelligence. Most of the time, the result has been disappointment. False alarms, interference from Earth, signals that vanish as quickly as they appear. Yet every time astronomers turn their dishes to the heavens, they know the possibility exists. The possibility that someone has been listening, and someone somewhere has decided to reply. And that possibility, however remote, is enough to make every accidental transmission feel like a gamble we didn't know we were making. If our first messages to the stars were accidents, what comes next will not be. We now live in an age of awareness, where every new signal carries with it the knowledge that it may not just be bouncing off satellites, but drifting into the ears of something unknown. The bubble continues to grow, and within its boundary may already be ears we cannot see, waiting to respond. Which leads us to the unsettling realization that the first step in humanity's dialogue with the cosmos has already been taken, not by design but by accident, and the next step, whether it's silence or a reply, is out of our hands. For decades, the idea of an interstellar visitor was confined to science fiction. Our solar system was imagined as a closed neighborhood where comets and asteroids circled endlessly, bound to the pull of the sun. The thought that something could arrive from outside, born around another star and passing briefly through our skies, was fascinating, but almost nobody expected to see it in their lifetime. That all changed in 2017, when astronomers spotted an object hurtling through space that didn't follow the rules. It was moving too fast on too sharp a trajectory, and no orbit could explain it. They named it Oumuamua, a Hawaiian word meaning scout or messenger, and in many ways, the name was fitting. It was the first confirmed interstellar object ever observed, and its arrival cracked open the illusion that our solar system was isolated. Suddenly, the idea of cosmic visitors wasn't a fantasy. It was a Oumuamua confounded scientists from the moment it was detected. Unlike the comets and asteroids we were used to, it had no tail of gas or dust streaming behind it. Instead, it seemed strangely smooth, reflecting sunlight in unpredictable ways that hinted at an elongated, almost cigar-like shape. Some measurements even suggested it could be flat, more like a pancake than a rock. And then came the most unsettling detail. As it passed the sun, it accelerated slightly as though something was pushing it. Natural explanations were put forward: outgassing, the release of frozen gases heating up near the sun, but no comet-like tail was ever seen. For some, the answer seemed obvious. This wasn't just a rock. Harvard astronomer Avi Loeb famously suggested it might be artificial, perhaps a fragment of alien technology drifting through space. The scientific community dismissed the idea as sensational, but the seed had been planted. If something could enter our system from the stars, who was to say it couldn't be more than just stone and ice? Just 2 years later, the discovery of another interstellar object deepened the mystery. This one was easier to classify a comet named Borisov, after the amateur astronomer who found it. Unlike Oumuamua, Borisov looked more familiar, trailing a tail of gas as it raced past the sun, but its very existence was just as shocking. 2 interstellar visitors discovered so close together suggested they might not be as rare as we once believed. Maybe the galaxy was filled with such wanderers, fragments of shattered worlds and rogue material constantly slipping between stars. Some scientists estimated that trillions of interstellar objects could be drifting through the Milky Way at any given time, like cosmic flotsams scattered by the tides of gravity. If true, that meant Earth wasn't just being bombarded by rocks from our own backyard, but by material with origins across the galaxy. The walls of our neighborhood weren't walls at all, they were porous, and we had been blind to it. What made Oumuamua and Borisov so important wasn't just their novelty, it was the way they forced us to rethink the flow of matter and the exchange of information across the cosmos. If fragments of alien worlds could reach us, then perhaps fragments of ours had reached others. Every supernova, every collision, every violent birth or death of a star sent material scattering across light years. Embedded in that material could be chemistry, building blocks of life, or even more. For the first time, we had direct evidence that the galaxy was not a collection of isolated islands, but a sea of currents carrying travelers far and wide. But Oumuamua lingered as an unsolved riddle. The acceleration remained unexplained, the shape remained ambiguous, and the lack of outgassing defied every attempt to paint it as ordinary. For years, the debate simmered. Some clung to the possibility of alien technology, perhaps a solar sail, a probe, or debris from a civilization we would never meet. Others insisted on natural explanations that stretched existing models to their limits. But whatever the truth, the psychological shift had already happened. Humanity had learned that interstellar objects weren't theoretical, they were real, and they could appear at any moment. And with that realization came the natural next question. What if the next one wasn't just a rock? The mere idea electrified the scientific community. Telescopes and surveys were recalibrated to hunt for the next interstellar visitor. Sky-scanning programs like Pan-STARRS and the Vera Rubin Observatory prioritized deep surveys capable of catching fast-moving anomalies. Governments took notice too, realizing that objects from beyond the solar system weren't just scientific curiosities, they could also be hazards. A rock moving at interstellar speeds would strike with unimaginable force if it ever collided with Earth. The world's defense systems were designed for local asteroids, not interstellar missiles. The visitors had shifted the conversation from "are we alone" to "what if they come closer?" The strangeness of Oumuamua also bled into public imagination. News outlets asked whether it was a probe, podcasts debated its origins, and science fiction writers found themselves with new inspiration. For decades, alien contact stories had been built on speculation. Now suddenly there was a real mystery floating in the void, a tangible artifact of the galaxy's broader life. Even skeptics admitted that Oumuamua raised questions science couldn't yet answer, and questions, especially unanswered ones, are fuel for wonder. As the years passed and the memory of Oumuamua faded from headlines, the stage was set for the next discovery. Humanity had been primed. We had learned that visitors were possible, maybe even common. We had learned that not everything arriving from interstellar space fit into our category, and most importantly, we had learned that the universe had a way of surprising us when we least expected it. When the next object appeared, moving fast, with strange properties and signals that didn't look like random noise, the world wasn't just ready to notice, it was ready to believe. Because once you've seen a messenger from the stars, It's impossible to shake the thought, what if it really was a messenger? And if that thought lodges deep enough, every new discovery feels like a whisper, a hint, or a warning. That's how humanity entered the 2020s, not with the certainty of being alone, but with the suspicion that we had already been visited. And when the next visitor arrived, carrying not just a strange orbit, but a message we couldn't ignore, the suspicion turned into something much bigger. It turned into the realization that we were no longer just observers of the universe. We had become participants in a story far older and far larger than our own. By the time the next interstellar visitor arrived, the world was already watching. After Oumuamua and Borisov, telescopes were tuned to catch anything that moved against the familiar backdrop of our skies. Surveys like Pan-STARRS and the ATLAS system in Hawaii swept the heavens night after night, hunting for faint points of light that behaved just a little too strangely to be local. And in the spring of 2025, the breakthrough came. The ATLAS telescope flagged a new object, faint but distinct, moving faster than anything bound to the sun. Astronomers quickly ran the calculations, plotting its course, and the numbers told a story that made even the most cautious scientists sit up straight. This was no ordinary asteroid. It was on a hyperbolic trajectory, screaming through the solar system at a speed no homegrown rock could achieve. It was an interstellar visitor, the third ever detected, and it would soon be known as 3IATLAS. At first, the discovery seemed routine by cosmic standards. A new interstellar rock, perhaps another comet, something to study and then forget, as it vanished back into the dark. But within days, the data began to reveal things that didn't add up. The object wasn't just fast, it was oddly stable. Unlike Borisov's cometary tail or Oumuamua's tumbling spin, ATLAS rotated in a way that seemed almost controlled, as if some invisible hand kept it balanced. Its brightness too flickered with a rhythm that didn't match any natural reflection of sunlight. It wasn't the random glint of rock and ice, it was steady, almost deliberate. Astronomers argued over explanations, suggesting exotic compositions or strange geometries. But behind closed doors, the whispers had already begun. What if this one wasn't just a rock? The first real shock came when radio telescopes tuned in, almost as an afterthought. SETI researchers pointed their instruments toward ATLAS, curious to see if any stray emissions might be detected. And that's when the faint but unmistakable pulse appeared. At first it seemed like noise, a glitch in the system, but as the hours passed, the pattern grew undeniable. Narrowband radio signals were emanating from the object, steady and precise, at the exact frequency long dubbed the cosmic waterhole, 1420 MHz, the emission line of hydrogen. For decades, SETI had argued that if an alien civilization ever tried to broadcast to others, this frequency would be the obvious choice, the one point of reference any intelligent species would recognize. And now, from an interstellar visitor in our solar system, that frequency was ringing like a bell. The pulses weren't random. They came in sequences, long strings broken into regular intervals, and then into unmistakable mathematics. Prime numbers, the simplest, most universal language possible. Nature doesn't count prime numbers, life does. The implications hit like a thunderclap. For the first time in history, Earth wasn't just listening for signs of life in the universe, it was receiving one. ATLAS wasn't silent like Borisov, it wasn't ambiguous like Oumuamua. It was speaking, and it was speaking to us. News of the signal leaked almost immediately. The scientific teams tried to keep it contained, debating whether to confirm before more data was gathered. But in the age of instant communication, nothing stays secret for long. Within a week, headlines blared around the world, signal detected from interstellar object. Television anchors stumbled over the details, pundits argued over its meaning, and social media exploded with theories ranging from benevolent aliens to doomsday omens. The phrase ATLAS signal trended globally. For the first time, humanity wasn't just wondering if we were alone, we were confronting the possibility that someone had deliberately sent a message, and the messenger was hovering in our own backyard. Governments scrambled. Some called for caution, insisting it could be interference, a misunderstanding, or even a hoax. Others urged immediate contact, arguing that we couldn't afford to miss such a historic opportunity. But beneath the noise, one thing was clear: the data was real. The pulse at 1420 MHz was steady, measurable, and repeatable across observatories worldwide. It wasn't a glitch, and it wasn't Earth-based interference. ATLAS was broadcasting, and the world had no idea what to do about it. The timing of its discovery only added to the unease. Its trajectory wasn't random. It seemed almost too perfect. The object was passing close enough to Earth to be observed in detail, close enough to beam its signal clearly to our planet. Astronomers double-checked the numbers, wondering if chance alone could explain it. The odds stretched belief. Was it coincidence? Or had Atlas chosen its path? And if it had chosen, who or what was steering it? The scientific community fractured into camps. Some clung to natural explanations, arguing that exotic physics might explain the signal. Others pointed out that narrowband transmissions don't occur naturally. The prime numbers left little room for doubt. It was intentional, but intentional by whom? Was Atlas a probe, an ancient relic, or something else entirely? The debate grew heated, but one thing united everyone. More data was needed, and fast. Telescopes across the globe and satellites in orbit turned their attention to Atlas, pouring resources into unraveling the riddle. Every flicker of light, every spectral reading, every pulse of robo waves was scrutinized, compared and catalogued. Meanwhile, the world outside of science spun into chaos. Religions claimed vindication, some hailing the signal as divine proof, others warning of deception. Politicians issued conflicting statements, markets reeled, and ordinary people struggled to grasp what it all meant. The sense of uncertainty was overwhelming. For centuries, the question, "Are we alone?" had been philosophical, abstract, something to wonder about in quiet moments. Now it was practical, immediate, and terrifyingly real. The name 3IATLAS began to shift in meaning. What had once been just a catalogue entry became a symbol, a myth in the making. To some, Atlas was a harbinger, carrying warnings from the stars. To others, it was a beacon, proof that the universe was larger and richer than our small imaginations. But for scientists, the name carried a different weight, responsibility. Because if Atlas truly was a messenger, then its discovery marked the beginning of humanity's first conversation with another intelligence. And how that conversation began could shape everything that followed. What came next was inevitable. Humanity couldn't just observe forever. The question wasn't whether to reply, but when. And as the signal from Atlas continued, pulsing steadily with its simple mathematical language, the pressure to answer grew unbearable. The world waited, caught between awe and dread, knowing that whatever happened next would mark a turning point in our history. Because once you've received a message from the stars, there is no going back. The silence of the universe has been broken, and the only question left is whether we are ready for the reply. For weeks, astronomers tracked 3IATLAS as it drifted across the night sky, a faint but steady presence against the backdrop of stars. The signal it emitted pulses at 120 MHz. The hydrogen line was strange enough, but what happened next elevated the mystery from curiosity to crisis. At first, the transmission seemed simple, a repeating sequence of prime numbers that anyone could recognize as deliberate. But then, as the days turned into weeks, the signal began to evolve. It grew more complex, layers of modulation riding atop the carrier frequency as if the initial pulses had only been a greeting, a way to get our attention before something greater unfolded. The deeper scientists listened, the more patterns they uncovered, nested sequences of numbers, geometric arrangements, and ratios that aligned with universal constants. These weren't random signals. They were structured, deliberate, and far beyond the capacity of any known natural process. What unsettled researchers most was the precision. Natural radio sources, like pulsars or quasars, are noisy, chaotic, and often broad in their emissions. Atlas's signal was narrowband, razor-thin in frequency, stable to an accuracy that exceeded the best transmitters humanity had ever built. Even our most advanced radio observatories could not achieve such stability without constant recalibration. Yet here was an object drifting in interstellar space, pulsing out perfection. Some dismissed it as an artifact of instrumentation, a flaw in detection, but the same readings came from observatories across the globe. From Chile to China, from South Africa to Australia, every dish confirmed the same thing. The signal was real, and it was impossibly precise. Then came the moment that silenced even the skeptics. The pulses began to align into binary grids, patterns of ones and zeros that, when plotted, formed coherent shapes. At first they were simple: a square, a triangle, a circle, but soon they evolved into more complex forms, spirals resembling galaxies, waveforms that mirrored the structure of hydrogen atoms, and even diagrams that seemed to represent orbital systems. The kicker came when one grid appeared to depict a star with several dots arranged around it, unmistakably resembling planets. Astronomers froze when they realized what they were seeing. The configuration didn't match any random system. It matched our own: a central star, a handful of large planets, and a small dot third from the center, highlighted in a way that was impossible to misinterpret. Whoever was sending the signal wasn't just speaking mathematics. They were pointing directly at Earth. Panic and awe spread in equal measure. Governments demanded secrecy, insisting the message be withheld until decoded fully. But leaks ensured that within days, the entire world knew the Atlas signal wasn't just abstract math. It was communication, and its subject was us. News outlets declared it proof of alien contact, while skeptics accused scientists of hoaxes. But the data was undeniable. When plotted, the binary grids produced images, and those images contained information no natural process could generate. Something intelligent was broadcasting, and Earth was the target. What followed was a frenzy of decoding efforts. Supercomputers crunched terabytes of data, while linguists, mathematicians, and cryptographers worked side by side to extract meaning. At first, progress was slow. The messages were layered, as if encoded multiple times, with redundancy built in. But gradually, patterns emerged. Some sequences seemed to echo the famous 1974 Arecibo message humanity had sent decades earlier, as though Atlas were mirroring our own attempt at contact. It was eerie, almost mocking, like a cosmic echo of our voice bouncing back from the stars. Other parts of the signal went further, embedding ratios and formulas far beyond what we had transmitted. References to numbers like pi, e, and the fine structure constant suggested an intelligence fluent in the language of physics. And then there were the anomalies, strings of data that didn't fit any recognizable system, as if containing knowledge we hadn't yet discovered. The most chilling realization came when researchers noticed that parts of the signal matched Earth's historical broadcasts. Old radio patterns, snippets of frequency shifts, echoes of pulses that had left our atmosphere decades ago were embedded in the Atlas transmission. It was as if whoever sent the signal had been listening all along, collecting our stray broadcasts, cataloging them, and then sending them back with modifications. The implication was staggering. Not only had someone heard us, they had studied us, and now they were replying in a language that proved it. The idea that Earth's century of accidental leakage had reached alien ears was no longer hypothetical. It was the public reaction was explosive. To some, the signal was proof of hope, a cosmic handshake, evidence that we were not alone and that others had been waiting for us. To others, it was terrifying. If someone had been listening, then they had been observing, analyzing, perhaps even judging us. Conspiracy theories exploded across the internet. Some claimed the signal was a trap, a lure to draw humanity into revealing itself more fully. Others argued it was benevolent, a teacher offering knowledge beyond our reach. Governments wavered between caution and curiosity, unsure whether to prepare for contact or defense. For the first time in history, humanity had to consider that an alien intelligence wasn't just possible, it was reaching out, and it had already chosen the terms of conversation. The media branded it the impossible signal, a phrase that captured both its precision and its implications. Talk shows debated its meaning, religious leaders proclaimed it as prophecy fulfilled, and scientists struggled to maintain composure in the face of overwhelming evidence. The very foundations of human belief systems shook. If we were not alone, then every assumption about our place in the universe needed rethinking. Were we the students, the experiment, or the prey? Nobody knew, and the lack of answers only deepened the fear. Meanwhile, Atlas continued its journey, drifting silently but broadcasting relentlessly. Every day the signal grew richer, as though unfolding layer by layer. Patterns that at first seemed abstract now resolved into clearer sequences, like a language slowly teaching itself to its listener. Some researchers even suggested that the signal was adaptive, changing in response to how Earth was analyzing it. If true, it meant Atlas wasn't just transmitting blindly. It was interacting, learning, and perhaps even testing us. The question of how to respond loomed large. SETI had long debated the ethics of active messaging, warning that revealing ourselves could invite danger. Now that debate was no longer theoretical. Atlas was calling, and silence felt like its own kind of answer. The world fractured into factions, those who demanded a reply, those who urged caution, and those who insisted on ignoring it entirely. But with each passing day, the pressure mounted. The signal wasn't stopping, and its focus was unwavering. It was here for us, and it wasn't going away. In the end, the significance of the impossible signal wasn't just in its content. It was in what it represented. For the first time in history, Earth had proof that someone else was out there. Someone capable of crossing the gulf of space, not with ships or weapons, but with information. It was a reminder that intelligence doesn't need proximity to be powerful. A message can travel where bodies cannot. And Atlas had delivered a message that shattered the illusion of human solitude forever. As Atlas slipped deeper into the solar system, its signal continued to stream, unwavering and precise. Humanity was left staring at the stars, caught between awe and terror, knowing that the silence we once mistook for emptiness had been broken. The universe was speaking. The only question left was whether we were ready to listen. For a while, Atlas seemed like a singular mystery, a lone messenger drifting into our solar system, pulsing with impossible signals that no natural rock should ever produce. But just as scientists were beginning to focus all their efforts on decoding the transmissions, something happened that no one had anticipated. Atlas wasn't alone. Within weeks of its discovery, telescopes around the world began flagging new anomalies in the night sky. Objects that at first appeared to be faint specks of light moving against the backdrop of stars were soon revealed to be more interstellar visitors, one then another, then another. At first, astronomers thought it might be coincidence, a cluster of unrelated wanderers happening to pass near Earth at the same time. But as their trajectories were calculated, the truth emerged with chilling clarity. The new objects were not random. Their paths weren't haphazard. They were converging. And the point of convergence was unmistakable: Earth's orbital path. The news broke with a force that made the Atlas signal look tame. A single visitor was one thing. A fleet was something else entirely. Scientists rushed to reassure the public, calling the objects interstellar comets and natural clusters. But the data told a darker story. Each of the newcomers was moving at interstellar speeds too fast to be bound to the sun, and yet their trajectories matched with a precision no natural origin could explain. More disturbing still, as radio telescopes tuned into each object, the signals were there too. Fainter at first, but unmistakable, narrow band emissions at the hydrogen line, each carrying sequences of pulses. They weren't identical copies of Atlas's transmission, but variations, like voices in a chorus, each one slightly different but harmonizing with the others. Suddenly the Atlas signal was no longer a solitary message. It was part of a network, a chorus of interstellar objects, each broadcasting its own line of communication, converging on our part of the galaxy. For the first time, humanity had to consider the possibility that what we had thought was an accident, one object wandering too close to the sun, was anything but. This was coordinated. This was deliberate. Governments scrambled into emergency sessions. Military satellites were retasked to track the incoming visitors. Defense systems were quietly put on alert, and space agencies were ordered to provide constant updates. Publicly, officials tried to downplay the fear, emphasizing science and discovery, but behind closed doors the mood was grim. Humanity had never faced the idea of alien fleets arriving, not as abstract UFO speculation, but as confirmed astronomical fact. And while there was no sign of weapons or aggression, the sheer scale of the convergence was terrifying. As the fleet grew, so did the complexity of the transmissions. What had begun as prime numbers and simple patterns evolved into overlapping sequences. When the signals from multiple objects were combined, they created interference patterns that formed even more intricate structures. It was as though each object carried one part of a larger message, and only by analyzing them together could the full picture emerge. For scientists, it was both exhilarating and horrifying. The data was too rich to ignore, but the implications were staggering. Whoever or whatever was behind these signals wasn't just broadcasting randomly. They were orchestrating a message across multiple platforms, synchronized across interstellar space, targeted directly at us. The public response was chaotic. Some embraced the fleet as a sign of benevolence, believing the newcomers were ambassadors or explorers offering knowledge to humanity. Others descended into panic, convinced this was the prelude to invasion. Religious groups split between those declaring salvation had arrived and those warning of deception. Conspiracy theories exploded online, claims that governments had known all along, that Atlas was a Trojan horse, that the fleet was already preparing to land. Markets swung wildly, international relations strained, and beneath it all lay a simple, terrifying question: what did they want? Meanwhile, astronomers pushed forward with decoding. By feeding the combined signals into supercomputers, they began to piece together more layers of information. Some patterns echoed familiar human transmissions, mirroring fragments of our own radio history. Others contained new data that defied interpretation, strange sequences that hinted at technologies or sciences beyond our comprehension. And woven through it all was one consistent theme: reference to Earth. The objects weren't just broadcasting, they were focused. Every modulation, every variation in the signal pointed back to our planet. Humanity was the target audience, whether we liked it or not. As more objects were detected, the fleet took on a staggering scale. By mid-2025, over a dozen interstellar visitors had been confirmed, each on a trajectory that would bring it near Earth's orbit within months. None were on collision courses, but their synchronized arrival was too precise to dismiss. They would pass near enough to be studied in detail, near enough to keep their signals loud and clear. The term fleet stuck, not because they looked like ships in a science fiction movie, but because their coordination left no doubt of intent. They were moving with purpose, and their purpose was up. The tension reached a breaking point when one of the newcomers emitted a signal that directly referenced Atlas's transmission. The two patterns synced, as though in dialogue, creating an interference pattern that formed an even more complex message. To researchers, it was the clearest evidence yet that the objects were not isolated. They were part of a larger system, working together, communicating as one. Humanity wasn't listening to a single messenger anymore. It was eavesdropping on a conversation conducted across the stars. And the most chilling realization of all was that we weren't just observers, we were participants. The messages weren't abstract. They were aimed at us, pulling us into a dialogue we hadn't agreed to join. In the streets, the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to dread. People looked at the sky differently, aware that a fleet of alien messengers was converging invisibly above them. Protests erupted in some cities, demanding governments turn off the radios and stop engaging. In others, vigils were held, with crowds gathering to welcome the visitors through music, chants, and prayer. Humanity was fracturing under the weight of its first undeniable contact. And yet, despite the fear, the signals kept coming, unwavering, precise, impossible to ignore. Scientists began to suspect that the fleet was staging something larger. The synchronization of the transmissions suggested a countdown, a build-up toward a single event. Data analysts noticed repeating cycles that grew shorter with each week, as though leading toward a crescendo. The possibility loomed that the fleet wasn't just passing through, it was preparing for a coordinated broadcast, a single message too massive for one object alone to deliver. If true, then Earth wasn't just receiving scattered signals, it was being prepared for a revelation. The phrase coordinated mission entered the lexicon, and with it came the realization that humanity's place in the universe had changed forever. No longer could we pretend to be isolated, unique, or hidden. Our accidental broadcasts had been heard, and the reply had arrived, not from one, but from many. Atlas was only the beginning. Now, an entire fleet of interstellar messengers was converging, their signals weaving into a tapestry of meaning we had barely begun to unravel. And through it all, one thought haunted everyone from scientists to civilians. If this was just the opening act, what would come next? For weeks, the transmissions from Atlas and the fleet were treated as puzzles, each one feeding into supercomputers that worked tirelessly to tease out meaning. At first, the data seemed impossibly dense, a storm of binary sequences that looked more like static than language. But the deeper analysts went, the more they realized that the noise wasn't random at all. Hidden within the apparent chaos were layers of redundancy, repetitions so subtle they only revealed themselves after millions of iterations were processed. The redundancy was a clue. The signals weren't just meant to be decoded, they were meant to be understood, structured so that even a civilization with limited technology could eventually extract the truth. That realization electrified the scientific community. Whoever had sent the signals wasn't trying to obscure information. They were trying to teach. The first breakthrough came when researchers noticed that certain sequences repeated across multiple objects. When aligned, they formed a consistent pattern that, when plotted visually, created a striking image, a double helix. The representation of DNA was unmistakable, and it shook the world to its core. For decades, humanity had speculated on how an alien civilization might try to communicate. Mathematics was the universal language, but biology, that was personal. A message about DNA wasn't just abstract, it was intimate, suggesting the senders not only knew life existed on Earth, but understood its foundations. The implication was staggering. They had studied us deeply, perhaps through our leaked broadcasts, perhaps through other means. Whatever the case, the message was clear. They knew who we were. But the DNA helix wasn't the end. The next layer revealed something even more unsettling. Embedded within the sequences were variations of the helix structure, twisted in ways that didn't match terrestrial biology. At first they looked like errors, mutations, meaningless distortions. But as biologists studied them, a terrifying possibility emerged. These weren't mistakes. They were alternative codes, blueprints for genetic systems different from our own. Some resembled RNA sequences, others bore no resemblance to anything on Earth. The fleet wasn't just sending us our own biological fingerprint, it was showing us others. Whether they were from the senders themselves or from species they had encountered, nobody could say. But the meaning was unavoidable. We were not the only form of life catalogue. The discovery ignited both excitement and dread. Optimists declared it proof of a galactic community, a cosmic library of life shared across the stars. Pessimists warned that we were being catalogued, tagged, like specimens in a database. Governments debated furiously behind closed doors. Was this a gift of knowledge or the prelude to something darker? The public fractured. Some embraced the idea of interstellar kinship, imagining a universe teeming with diverse life. Others recoiled, fearing humanity was just one of countless species being observed, studied, and perhaps controlled. As more of the signal was decoded, patterns within the noise grew clearer. Whole sections of data appeared to reference Earth directly. Maps of our solar system were reconstructed, showing not only the Sun and planets, but Earth's orbital characteristics with uncanny precision. The maps highlighted our position relative to nearby stars, suggesting the senders knew exactly where to find us. And then came the part that sparked the loudest debates: sequences resembling timelines, long streams of binary numbers organized in such a way that they seemed to depict intervals of time measured against pulsar frequencies. When converted, those intervals matched key milestones in human history: the rise of industrial emissions, the first radio broadcasts, the nuclear age, all marked in the data as though someone had been keeping track. It was at this point that even the most hardened skeptics could no longer dismiss the implications. The signals weren't a random cosmic curiosity, they were a record of us. And hidden within the record was something else: projection. Data streams that didn't align with past events, but with possible futures. Environmental models showing rising temperatures, collapsing ecosystems, and dwindling resources. Energy projections that mirrored our unsustainable growth. To some, it looked like a warning, an alien civilization trying to tell us what lay ahead if we failed to change course. To others, it looked like something more ominous, a diagnosis, as though humanity was a patient under examination, with prognosis included. The debate reached fever pitch when one group of cryptographers claimed to have decoded a direct directive within the noise, a repeating sequence that, when translated into English, could be read as Others insisted this was a misinterpretation, the result of forcing language where none existed. But the idea stuck. Prepare for what? Contact? Catastrophe? Assimilation? Nobody could agree, but the fear spread like wildfire. Protests erupted in major cities, some demanding governments send a reply, others demanding silence at all costs. Meanwhile, fringe groups claimed the fleet had already infiltrated Earth, pointing to unexplained phenomena and vanishing satellites as evidence. In laboratories, the work continued. The more the signals were decoded, the more they seemed to contain. What had once looked like static now unraveled into images, diagrams, even audio-like sequences. One set of modulations, when converted into sound, produced haunting tones that some interpreted as music. Another sequence appeared to depict structures, geometric forms, so advanced they defied human engineering. Were they blueprints, warnings, or something else entirely? Then came the chilling discovery. One researcher in Europe noticed that a small portion of the signal contained exact replicas of human voices, not just generic sounds, but recognizable words and phrases lifted from historical broadcasts. Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech, Armstrong's One Small Step, even snippets of forgotten radio programs from the early 20s. The fleet wasn't just aware of us. It had been listening, recording, and now it was sending our own voices back to us. The symbolism was inescapable. They weren't just showing that they knew us, they were showing us that we had already spoken, and they had never stopped listening. As the message unfolded, one truth became undeniable. The noise wasn't noise at all. It was a multi-layered communication designed to be decoded gradually, like a puzzle that revealed deeper truths the longer you stared at it. And yet, for all the breakthroughs, one question loomed larger than ever. What was the ultimate point? Were these layers leading to a climax, a single message that would tie it all together? Or were they endless, designed to keep us occupied, distracted, forever decoding, while the true purpose unfolded elsewhere? The uncertainty was maddening. Humanity had always longed for contact. But now that it had arrived, the form it took was more terrifying than reassuring. Because within the noise, one fact was unavoidable. We were not alone, and whoever had reached out to us wasn't sending pleasantries or casual greetings. They were sending knowledge, warnings and reminders that we had already been seen, studied and judged. The world held its breath as scientists worked, hoping that the next layer of noise would contain the answer everyone craved, friend or foe. But as the signals deepened and the patterns grew richer, the truth became clearer. The answer would not be simple. The message within the noise wasn't meant to comfort, it was meant to change us. The moment the world realized the fleet signals weren't just static but layered communication, something broke across humanity. The discovery of DNA sequences, alternative genetic blueprints and timelines mapping not only our past but our possible futures, didn't unify the planet as many science fiction dreams once predicted. Instead, it split us. Every fragment of decoded data became a spark thrown into a tinderbox of competing ideologies, agendas, and fears. The global divide began slowly at first, like fractures spreading unseen beneath the surface. But soon the cracks widened until they became chasms that no bridge could cross. Nations had always guarded their secrets, but now secrecy became survival. Governments hoarded the decoded fragments they possessed, unwilling to share them fully even with allies. In Washington, officials argued bitterly over whether the information should be classified as national security data or shared openly with the global scientific community. In Beijing, the ruling party declared that any revelation from the fleet would be treated as a matter of state defense, warning against foreign interference. Russia's leadership, always wary of Western narratives, dismissed public reports of the Prepare Directive as manipulations designed to sow panic. Meanwhile, smaller nations felt cornered, demanding access to the data but finding themselves shut out of the secretive networks where the decoding took place. Trust evaporated, replaced by suspicion as every country began to wonder if its rivals had uncovered messages of power, technologies, or warnings it had not. This political fragmentation quickly spilled over into the public sphere. Religious groups interpreted the signals through the lens of their doctrines. Some hailed the fleet as divine messengers, angels disguised as machines, delivering truths humanity had long awaited. Others saw them as deceivers, dark entities meant to lead the faithful astray. In certain regions, sermons declared the DNA patterns proof of creation by a higher hand, while in others, leaders condemned them as tests of faith, temptations meant to lure souls into abandoning belief. Entire congregations split apart, with some embracing the signals as prophecy fulfilled, while others clung tightly to the rejection of alien influence as heresy. At the same time, the scientific community fractured in its own way. On one side were those who saw the signals as the greatest opportunity in history, an interstellar library of knowledge humanity could not afford to ignore. On the other side were those who feared that even attempting to decode or respond was reckless, a dangerous gamble with unknown consequences. Heated debates turned colleagues into enemies. Conferences devolved into shouting matches. Careers were ruined by accusations of bias, misinterpretation, or political influence. Science had always prided itself on being a universal language, but under the pressure of the fleet's revelations, it became just as divided as politics or religion. The economic world was no more stable, Markets responded to each new revelation with wild swings. Companies scrambled to patent anything remotely related to genetic engineering, quantum communication, or energy technology, fearing that hidden within the signals might be the seeds of inventions that could upend entire industries. Tech giants poured billions into private decoding labs, hoping to leap ahead of governments and rivals. Meanwhile, conspiracy theorists argued that corporations were deliberately suppressing parts of the message to profit from selective revelation. The phrase alien patents became a meme, both mocking and fearful, as people imagined shadowy boardrooms sitting on otherworldly knowledge, while the rest of humanity remained in the dark. For ordinary people, the divide cut deepest at the level of fear versus hope. Some saw the signals as salvation, the promise that humanity was not alone and could one day join a larger cosmic community. Movements formed under banners of the welcome, where members gathered in public squares to sing, chant, and broadcast their own signals into space as gestures of openness. But in contrast, others turned inward, demanding isolation, silence, and defense. "Do not reply" became the rallying cry of those who believed any response would invite disaster. Online forums filled with heated arguments, accusations, and doomsday predictions. Families split along ideological lines. Parents refused to let their children attend alien welcome events, fearing abduction or brainwashing. The divide wasn't abstract, it was tearing households apart. Even the military world fractured. Defense alliances like NATO struggled to maintain cohesion as members argued over whether the fleet represented a threat to be countered or an opportunity to be engaged. Secretive programs launched to explore weaponization of any decoded knowledge, while other factions pushed for treaties to prevent militarization of the signals altogether. In whispers, rumors spread of clandestine experiments already underway, attempts to replicate alien genetic codes or harness energy patterns embedded in the noise. Whether true or not, the rumors were enough to fuel paranoia and deepen divide. And then there was the cultural response. Artists, writers, and filmmakers seized on the fleet as a new wellspring of creativity. Songs were composed from the haunting tones extracted from the signals. Novels and films painted visions of utopia or apocalypse, each finding eager audiences hungry for meaning. But culture too became divided. Some works celebrated the fleet as humanity's next step. Others portrayed it as the beginning of the end. The very act of interpreting the signals became a battleground of ideas, where every perspective revealed more about the interpreter than the message itself. In the midst of all this division, one constant remained. The signals did not stop. Every day they poured in with unwavering precision. More layers, more complexity, more revelations that deepened the divides instead of bridging them. Governments demanded patience, insisting more time was needed to decode, but the public grew restless. The fear was not only about what was being revealed, but about what was not. If parts of the signals contained warnings or threats, who was deciding what the world was allowed to know? Distrust in institutions reached unprecedented levels. Riots broke out in several countries, fueled by accusations that leaders were hiding the truth. In some cities, people smashed radio telescopes and observatory equipment, convinced they were inviting danger by listening. In others, vigilantes tried to build their own receivers, desperate to bypass authorities and decode the signals themselves. The global divide was no longer just philosophical or political. It had become a raw struggle for control, with every faction convinced that their interpretation was the only path to survival. For some, survival meant embracing the fleet as friends. For others, it meant preparing for war. And for still others, it meant turning away, refusing to engage, hoping that silence might somehow undo what had already begun. Yet through all the chaos, one fact lingered in the background, uniting all factions in unease. The fleet was still converging. More objects were detected every month, each broadcasting its part of the chorus, each aligning its trajectory toward Earth's orbit. And buried within the signals, one theme repeated with haunting regularity, no matter the variation or layer. A message that some insisted was a directive, others a prophecy, and still others a threat. A simple word, encoded in prime sequences and echoed across the noise. Prepare. But prepare for what? That was the question tearing humanity apart. And as the divide deepened, as trust dissolved and fear spread, the possibility loomed that the answer would come not from decoding, but from what happened when the fleet finally arrived. By the time the fleet had grown to more than 24 objects, the signals began to change in ways that left no doubt something was coming. For months, researchers had treated the transmissions as static puzzles, layered codes, images, DNA strands, and warnings. But now, beneath all of that, a new pattern emerged. It wasn't hidden this time. It wasn't buried in redundancy or disguised as static. It was loud, clear, and undeniable. A sequence of pulses repeating in decreasing intervals, like the ticking of a clock counting down. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence. Natural cycles exist in astrophysical phenomena, and perhaps the alignment of signals from multiple objects simply gave the illusion of synchronization. But as days passed, the intervals shortened predictably, and the realization spread like wildfire through the scientific community. This wasn't random. The fleet was counting towards something. The word countdown became the headline in every corner of the world. Analysts filled television screens with diagrams showing the shortening intervals, graphs displaying how all the objects were syncing their transmissions with increasing precision. Some predicted the final convergence would occur within weeks, others within days. The most conservative estimates gave humanity 2 months before the countdown ended, but no one could explain what would happen when it reached zero. Was it a broadcast, a signal burst powerful enough to engulf the planet, a revelation of knowledge, or a weapon cloaked in information? The uncertainty was unbearable. Governments scrambled to prepare, but preparation for what was an impossible question. In the United States, contingency plans were drawn up for communication, defense, and evacuation of major cities. Europe debated whether to attempt a reply before the countdown ended, fearing silence might be interpreted as defiance. China declared it was already building facilities to withstand potential electromagnetic pulses or atmospheric disruptions. Russia warned that the countdown was proof of hostile intent, and quietly mobilized parts of its military in case Earth needed to respond with force. For the first time in history, nuclear arsenals were put on higher alert, not against rival nations but against the unknown in the sky. The public reacted with predictable chaos. For those who had already feared the signals, the countdown was confirmation of their worst nightmares. Panic buying emptied grocery stores. Survivalist groups retreated into bunkers, and riots broke out in cities where governments were perceived as withholding information. In contrast, groups that had embraced the fleet as saviors declared the countdown a sign of imminent contact, a moment of revelation where humanity would finally join a galactic community. Massive gatherings formed in public squares, people holding signs that read, "We are ready," or "Take us with you." Some chose to treat the countdown like a religious festival, chanting, singing, or meditating at exact intervals to synchronize with the pulses. The world split between fear and worship, and every passing hour amplified the divide. Meanwhile, the signals themselves grew louder. Radio telescopes detected increasing strength, as though the fleet were amplifying its transmissions in preparation for the climax. The pulses became sharper, the harmonics richer, as if all objects were funneling energy into the same message. Supercomputers working on the data noticed something even more disturbing. The countdown was not only synchronized across the fleet, but adjusted in real time to Earth's reception. In other words, the fleet wasn't blindly ticking down, it was calibrating, ensuring that its final message would be received with absolute precision. The implication was chilling. Whoever was behind the signals wasn't guessing at our technology, they understood it perfectly. Among scientists, a grim consensus formed. The countdown would end with a broadcast, something larger and more complex than anything sent before. The question was whether humanity should attempt to reply first, to show we were active participants, not passive receivers. Some argued silence would look primitive, even disrespectful. Others insisted any response risked provoking unknown consequences. For decades, SETI had debated whether active messaging was wise. Now the luxury of debate was gone. The fleet was forcing the issue humanity would soon receive something it couldn't ignore. As the countdown progressed, anomalies began to appear in the transmissions. Strange bursts of data, out of sync with the prime pulses, like glitches or interruptions. At first they were dismissed as artifacts, but analysis revealed they were consistent across multiple objects. Hidden within the countdown were brief flashes of images, too fragmented to fully decode, but haunting nonetheless. One appeared to show an outline of Earth, another a pattern resembling human figures. Conspiracy theorists declared the fleet was mapping us for invasion, while optimists saw it as confirmation of contact, proof the countdown was leading to a message about us, not against us. The truth remained elusive, but the fragments only added to the tension. With each passing day, The intervals shortened. What had once been hours between pulses became minutes, then seconds. The world entered a state of suspended breath. Governments declared states of emergency, stock markets froze, schools closed, and people stayed glued to broadcast showing live updates of the countdown as though waiting for a rocket launch. Except this wasn't a launch, it was a moment of contact or catastrophe. Humanity's collective attention was locked on the sky, on the relentless ticking of pulses that grew sharper, closer and louder. And then just as the countdown neared its final stages, something no one expected happened. For the first time since the signals began, the fleet fell silent. Every object stopped transmitting at once, leaving a void of static where, for months, there had been relentless precision. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than the signals themselves. Had the countdown been aborted? Was this the end? The world froze, waiting for something, anything to break the stillness. Minutes passed, then hours, with no transmission. Panic spread as people feared the silence was the precursor to something catastrophic. Military radars scanned the skies, but the objects themselves remained in place, drifting silently, no longer pulsing their enigmatic codes. Finally, after nearly a full day of silence, the fleet spoke again, but this time the signal was different. All the objects transmitted the same sequence simultaneously, a unified broadcast unlike anything heard before. The message was long, continuous, and far more complex than previous signals, a torrent of information so vast that even the most powerful supercomputers struggled to process it. The countdown had ended, and the broadcast had begun. What terrified everyone most wasn't just the size of the message, it was the clarity. There was no redundancy now, no layered static. The fleet wasn't testing us anymore, it was delivering something direct, deliberate and unmistakable. The world braced as decoding began, terrified of what truths or threats the countdown had prepared us to hear. Because whatever this broadcast contained, it wasn't just another puzzle hidden in the noise, it was the message the fleet had been waiting to deliver all along. When the fleet finally broke its silence, the broadcast came as a flood of data, so overwhelming, it dwarfed everything that had come before. For months, humanity had struggled to decode fragments, layered puzzles buried in noise. But this was different. There was no subtlety, no redundancy designed to ensure recognition. The message was clean, sharp and deliberate, transmitted simultaneously from every object in the fleet. To the untrained ear, it sounded like an ear-splitting shriek of radio energy. But to the world's observatories, it was something more terrifying. Clarity. This wasn't the trial and error communication humanity had imagined. It was a fully formed broadcast, like a teacher finally deciding the student was ready for the lesson. And the lesson began with something no one expected: imaging. For the first time, the transmissions didn't need endless interpretation. The data flowed in packets that translated directly into coherent visual forms when processed by even the simplest algorithms. Screens flickered as researchers watched shapes assemble in real time: grids, lines, and then unmistakable depictions. The first image displayed was a star, our sun. Around it, orbits appeared, each marked with precise mathematical notation. At the third orbit from the center, Earth was highlighted, glowing brighter than the others. It was not ambiguous. The message began with a declaration: "We see you. We know exactly where you are." Next came the sequence that turned awe into dread. From Earth's orbit, a line extended outward, not toward another star, but back toward the objects themselves. The implication was clear. They were not drifting here randomly. They had set their paths with intent, converging toward the very world they had marked. Humanity was not just being studied, it was being approached. The broadcast continued, now faster, streaming thousands of frames every minute. Images of DNA appeared again, spirals forming, breaking apart, and reforming into variants. This time the variations were more detailed, displaying not only familiar structures but entirely alien forms, some with triple helices, others twisted into configurations Earth biologists couldn't begin to categorize. The message was almost mocking in its clarity. Life did not belong solely to Earth. There were other blueprints, other experiments scattered across the galaxy. Humanity's biology was not unique, but just one of many entries in a library vast beyond comprehension. Then the images shifted. Cities appeared, not human ones, but alien constructs rendered in harsh geometry, impossible structures that seemed to bend space itself. Towers without bases, bridges that curved into spirals, patterns that looked more like fractals than architecture. Whether these were depictions of real alien civilizations or symbolic representations was impossible to know, but the effect was shattering. If they were real, then the fleet was not just a messenger but an envoy from a civilization far beyond us. If symbolic, then the broadcast was still clear. Intelligence is not yours alone. The most disturbing section followed. For nearly an hour, the images showed Earth itself. Not vague maps, but detailed depictions, continents outlined, coastlines traced, weather systems swirling above oceans. The data resolution was higher than any satellite had ever achieved, raising the horrifying question of how it was possible. Were the fleet's instruments observing us in real time from interstellar distances, or had they been studying us for far longer than we realized? And the images weren't frozen in the present. They changed. Forests shrank, ice caps melted, smog spread across continents. It was Earth's environmental decline, sped up and rendered with brutal accuracy. Every projection matched models that human climatologists had been warning about for decades. But now those warnings were being sent back to us by someone else. The message seemed undeniable. We know your trajectory. We know where you are failing. Governments tried to control the narrative, but within hours the broadcast leaked worldwide, screens filled with alien images, and the global population was united not in hope, but in shock. For every optimist who called it guidance or warning, there was a pessimist who saw judgment, even condemnation. If aliens knew so much about us, then they weren't just passers-by. They had been watching, recording, and perhaps deciding what humanity deserved. And then, as though to confirm those fears, the broadcast changed again. No longer images, but sound. A sequence of human voices began to play, distorted but recognizable. Words in dozens of languages, snatched from Earth's past. News broadcasts, speeches, casual conversations captured from radio static. The voices overlapped in eerie chorus, punctuated by alien tones that vibrated like music, yet carried mathematical precision. Humanity's own history, thrown back at it, woven into the alien signal, as though to say, "We have heard everything. We have learned who you are from your own words." The symbolism was chilling. The silence of the cosmos had never been real. We had been speaking to the void, and the void had always been listening. Some scientists insisted this was proof of benign contact, a cosmic mirror meant to show us ourselves so that we could change course. Others argued it was psychological warfare, a deliberate tactic to destabilize humanity by forcing it to confront its failures and mortality. The divide deepened further. In some cities, crowds cheered, seeing the broadcast as proof of cosmic kinship. In others, mobs stormed government buildings, furious at leaders who had downplayed the threat. Suicide rates spiked as people fell into despair, convinced humanity was doomed, judged and found wanting. Buried within the broadcast was one final twist that left even the most rational minds shaken. After hours of images and voices, the transmission shifted once more into pure mathematics. At first, it looked like another sequence of prime numbers and universal constants, the familiar language of science. But as researchers ran the numbers, they realized it wasn't just math. It was instruction. Detailed blueprints began to emerge, schematics for machines far beyond human engineering, energy systems that defied current physics, communication arrays capable of spanning light years, structures designed to manipulate matter at atomic scales. Some scientists hailed it as the gift of knowledge, proof that the fleet wanted to help us ascend. Others recoiled, fearing it was a trap, technology designed to enslave or destroy us once we built it. The instructions were too precise to be accidental, and the timing was too deliberate. This was what the countdown had been leading toward, a transfer of knowledge, or perhaps a test. The broadcast ended as suddenly as it began. After 12 hours of relentless transmission, the fleet fell silent again. No pulses, no noise, just the quiet of space. But the damage or the gift was already done. Humanity had received its first direct broadcast from another intelligence, and the message was impossible to ignore. We see you, we know you, we have been listening. And here is what comes next. The world was left in chaos. Scientists argued over the blueprints, governments scrambled to seize control of the data, religious leaders preached of judgment or salvation, and ordinary people looked at the sky with new fear. The broadcast had not answered the most important question, friend or foe. but it had removed the luxury of doubt. The universe was no longer silent. The fleet was no longer a mystery. Contact had been made, and the clock that had counted down to this moment left a deeper, darker question lingering in the minds of billions. Was this only the first broadcast, or just the beginning of something much larger? When the broadcast ended and the silence returned, humanity was left with more than fear. It was left with instructions. The blueprints embedded in the final portion of the signal spread across the globe within hours, no longer confined to government labs or secret research teams. Hackers, whistleblowers, and even official leaks ensured that every university, every corporation, every online forum had access to the same staggering schematics. For the first time in history, knowledge had arrived from beyond Earth, not in fragments or puzzles, but in clear, deliberate diagrams, and what followed was chaos. The blueprints didn't describe weapons, not at first glance. Instead, they showed designs for energy systems, unlike anything humanity had ever achieved. Machines that promised unlimited clean power, devices capable of bending electromagnetic fields with precision that bordered on magic, reactors that could produce output without the byproducts that had poisoned Earth for centuries. To optimists, this was the greatest gift imaginable. Proof not only that we weren't alone, but that those who had found us washed us to survive. The blueprints offered salvation from the crises that had plagued the planet: climate collapse, dwindling resources, inequality of power. If these machines could be built, humanity could finally leap into an age of abundance. But the skeptics saw something darker. Unlimited energy also meant unlimited potential for destruction. Devices capable of bending fields and manipulating atomic matter could be weaponized in ways no one could predict. The same diagrams that promised salvation could just as easily be tools of annihilation. And perhaps more chilling than the technology itself was the motive. Why had the fleet given humanity these designs? If they were benevolent, why not make contact openly, explain themselves, and guide us directly? Why choose to deliver knowledge in a way that guaranteed confusion, division, and chaos? Was this a test to see how humanity would react, or a trap meant to push us towards self-destruction? Governments immediately attempted to seize control of the debate. The United States declared the blueprints classified under national security and demanded their removal from public access. China called for global cooperation under its leadership, framing the broadcast as an opportunity to establish a new world order guided by discipline and control. Russia dismissed public panic and claimed the designs were already under review by its scientists. Europe tried to form a consortium, arguing that no single nation should control alien technology, but it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. Once released online, the schematics replicated endlessly, copied, archived, and reposted faster than any authority could suppress them. For the first time in history, humanity faced not only contact with another intelligence, but the sudden, uncontrollable democratization of alien knowledge. The scientific community fractured into factions. Some researchers threw themselves into deciphering the blueprints, eager to test whether the designs could actually be built with human materials and methods. Laboratories across the globe began crude attempts to replicate the machines on small scales, often with spectacular failures. Reports of explosions, power surges, and equipment destroyed spread quickly, but so did rumors of breakthroughs. An experimental physics group in Switzerland claimed to have achieved sustained reactions using only a fraction of the design, hinting that even partial replication could change the world. Meanwhile, cautious voices urged restraint, warning that tinkering with technology far beyond our comprehension was like handing nuclear reactors to cavemen. But their voices were drowned out by the race to be first. The public response was even more polarized. Some hailed the blueprints as a gift from the stars, proof that the fleet was benevolent, wanting humanity to rise above its current limitations. Movements formed around the idea of building the designs openly, without secrecy, as a way to prove humanity's worthiness. Others were convinced the blueprints were a Trojan horse knowledge designed to lure us into creating devices that would ultimately destroy us. Conspiracy forums buzzed with theories that the machines, once activated, would send signals back to the fleet, acting as beacons for invasion, or worse, as weapons that would turn against their creators. The word trap appeared in headlines, shouted in protests, painted on walls in graffiti, and beneath the chaos, something more insidious began to take hold. Division along economic lines. Wealthy nations and corporations had the resources to experiment with the blueprints, to build prototypes, to risk failure. Poorer nations were left to watch, fearing they would once again be left behind as the powerful gained an advantage so overwhelming it could never be undone. The technology, if real, promised to upend the balance of power more drastically than the discovery of fire or the invention of nuclear weapons. Control of it meant control of the future, and so the blueprint debate became not just a question of trust in the fleet, but a battle for dominance on Earth itself. Religious leaders weighed in with interpretations as fractured as the rest of society. Some declared the blueprints a divine gift, proof that humanity had been chosen to ascend. Others warned that they were a temptation, a test of faith, a false offering from deceivers. Entire denominations split apart as congregations chose sides, some building shrines to the fleet, while others condemned even the act of studying the designs as heresy. The cultural divide deepened, with art, music, and film reflecting the chaos. Some works celebrating humanity's impending leap into the stars, others depicting dystopian collapse brought on by alien manipulation. Meanwhile, the fleet remained silent. The objects drifted in their steady courses, their transmissions ended, as if waiting to see what humanity would do with what had been given. This silence was worse than the signals themselves. If the broadcast had been meant as guidance, why not continue? If it had been meant as warning, why not explain further? The silence left only ambiguity, and in that ambiguity humanity turned inward, fighting itself with increasing ferocity. In laboratories, breakthroughs and disasters came in equal measure. A team in Japan claimed to have replicated a small-scale energy field described in the blueprints, producing a stable reaction that could run indefinitely. But within days, their facility was destroyed in an unexplained accident, sparking rumors of sabotage. In the Middle East, the startup announced it had successfully followed one of the designs to create a power generator, only to vanish from the public eye under government pressure. In America, leaked documents suggested the military had already built a working prototype of one of the devices, though no proof was ever released. Each rumor, each claim, fueled more speculation, more mistrust, more fear. The blueprint debate consumed humanity. Was this a gift or a trap? A chance to ascend or a lure into self-destruction? Every faction believed it held the truth, and every faction saw the others as dangerous. What no one could deny was that the debate itself was reshaping the world. The old divisions of nation, class and belief were replaced by one singular divide: build or destroy, trust or refuse, embrace or reject. And while humanity argued, the fleet drifted silently above, patient, inscrutable, as though the outcome had already been decided. The blueprints had done more than offer technology. They had forced humanity to reveal itself, to show whether it was capable of unity or doomed to fracture. And as the debate raged on, one truth became painfully clear. The fleet had given us knowledge, but the test was never about the machine, it was about us. The blueprint debate might have begun as an argument of ideas, but it didn't take long for it to spill into action, and from action into sabotage. Around the world, hidden laboratories hummed with attempts to bring the alien designs to life. But for every breakthrough announced in whispers, there came sudden setbacks, strange accidents, and disasters too consistent to ignore. At first, people blamed human error. The machines were too advanced, too alien, for us to replicate without mishaps. Explosions, electrical fires, magnetic surges. It made sense to expect accidents when tampering with forces we didn't fully understand. But as the list of incidents grew longer, and as the timing of those incidents began to align with political tensions, suspicion spread like wildfire. Was humanity sabotaging itself, or was something else, something watching, intervening? The first whispers came after the Japan incident. The research group that had claimed to produce a stable energy field reported their success in a private communication to colleagues abroad. Within 48 hours, their facility was destroyed. Officially, it was called a containment failure, a catastrophic meltdown caused by pushing their prototype too far. But no radiation leaked, no typical signs of explosion were present. The facility was reduced to slag, as if by forces not explained by physics we understood. Rumors swirled that a satellite had recorded a flash of light just above the lab seconds before the disaster, something that didn't match any known atmospheric or orbital event. The data vanished before it could be confirmed. Theories spread that another nation had intervened, unwilling to let Japan claim a lead. But darker voices began to whisper another possibility. The fleet had noticed and had erased the experiment before it could grow. In the Middle East, a small startup funded by wealthy investors announced privately to governments that it had successfully constructed a functioning generator from one of the simpler designs. Within days, every trace of the startup was gone. Its website went dark, its employees disappeared, and its headquarters stood empty, abandoned with meals still sitting on tables, as if everyone had simply vanished mid-step. Local authorities claimed the company had been a fraud, a scam dissolved under legal pressure. But photographs of their prototype, leaked by a whistleblower, showed a machine that matched the alien schematics perfectly. The image of its faint glow, unnatural in color and form, circulated online before being scrubbed. Was it shut down by governments, or was something else silencing those who came too close? In America, leaks suggested the military had already achieved limited success replicating one of the alien field devices, though details were buried in classified documents. Then came a wave of unexplained power outages across several states, each coinciding with locations rumored to toast hidden prototypes. Officials blamed storms, infrastructure, and cyber attacks. But eyewitnesses described strange phenomena, auroras glowing in skies hundreds of miles from the poles, objects levitating for seconds before crashing down, magnetic compasses spinning wildly in directions that made no sense. To conspiracy theorists, it was proof. The alien technology worked, but something or someone was disrupting it before it could stabilize. As these incidents multiplied, the word sabotage stopped being metaphor and became accusation. Nations accused each other of conducting secret operations to destroy prototypes. Corporations accused governments of theft and suppression. Protest groups accused shadowy elites of trying to monopolize alien technology while silencing independent attempts. But beneath the human finger-pointing lurked the chilling possibility that none of us were responsible, that the same intelligence which had sent the blueprints was monitoring how we handled them, and choosing to intervene whenever the line was crossed. The silence of the fleet no longer seemed passive. It felt watchful. Ordinary people reacted with paranoia. Some believed any attempt to build the machines was inviting disaster, not because of human incompetence, but because the fleet would punish those who tried. Others doubled down, convinced that the accidents were proof of suppression, that humanity was being deliberately held back by elites colluding with the fleet or hiding the truth. Movements formed in both directions. Stop the build groups who demanded all blueprint research cease, and builders who sought to continue the work in secret, believing the accidents were fabricated lies. Underground labs began springing up, hidden in basements, warehouses, even abandoned factories, where amateur engineers and rogue scientists risked their lives attempting to replicate alien technology with whatever scraps they could acquire. Some succeeded in creating strange effects, lights that wouldn't extinguish, vibrations that resonated through walls without sound, fields that bent metal like clay. Others simply vanished, their experiments ending in silence and scorched ruin. The paranoia deepened when satellites detected anomalies near the fleet itself. Several of the interstellar objects pulsed faintly, not in the familiar countdown or broadcasts, but in irregular bursts that seemed reactive. Some analysts suggested the bursts coincided with incidents on Earth, as though the fleet were responding to activity below. If true, it meant the fleet wasn't waiting for us to act. It was monitoring every step, every experiment, perhaps even enforcing boundaries. Theories erupted. The fleet had set conditions, rules we couldn't see, and whenever we crossed them they struck. Whether the interventions were warnings or punishments, no one could agree. But the implication was terrifying. Humanity wasn't experimenting in secret, it was experimenting under surveillance. And then came the most haunting incident. A European facility claimed it had stabilized a device that bent electromagnetic fields in ways previously impossible. For 12 hours, the machine ran without failure, producing an energy field that could power an entire city. The team planned a public demonstration, risking the fury of governments in order to prove their success. On the eve of the reveal, the skies above the facility darkened without warning. Witnesses described a cloud forming unnaturally fast, swirling directly above the lab. Lightning struck, not once, not twice, but continuously, hammering the building until it collapsed in flames. The storm dissipated within an hour, as though it had never existed. Meteorologists called it an anomaly, but to those who had seen the prototype glow, there was no doubt the fleet had erased it. By now, even the most rational minds struggled to dismiss the pattern. Too many accidents, too many coincidences, too many anomalies that defied natural explanation. Something or someone was making sure humanity couldn't yet wield what had been given, whether it was rival nations, hidden human powers, or the fleet itself. The result was the same. Sabotage was everywhere, shadows moving unseen to suppress progress. Humanity had been handed a test, and every attempt to cheat its boundaries ended in disaster. The psychological toll was immense. Scientists hesitated to continue, fearing not just failure but obliteration. Protesters filled streets with signs reading, "They are watching and stop the test." Meanwhile, underground builders turned more radical, convinced that the only way forward was to overwhelm the sabotage with sheer numbers, to replicate experiments faster than they could be destroyed. Some even argued the sabotage proved we were close to success, that the accidents meant the technology worked, and that was why someone wanted it stopped. As the fleet drifted silently above, its strange bursts pulsing like distant heartbeats, humanity found itself staring into the shadows. Were we destroying ourselves out of fear and rivalry, or was the fleet intervening, controlling, manipulating our every step? No one knew, and the uncertainty was worse than truth. Because in the absence of clarity, every accident, every vanished lab, every unexplained disaster carried the same chilling message: humanity was not in control. Someone else was. For months, after the wave of sabotage and unexplained disasters, the fleet remained quiet, drifting like a wall of shadows in the heavens. The silence was oppressive, heavier than the broadcasts that had shattered it before, because it carried the weight of expectation. Humanity lived in the constant awareness that the fleet was watching, not idly but actively, its presence looming over every decision made below. The accidents, the storms, the unexplained vanishings, all of them had convinced billions that the objects were not passive relics but guardians, enforcers, perhaps even judges. And in that silence, the world began to fracture along a new fault line. Those who believed the fleet demanded compliance, and those who believed the silence itself was a message, an ultimatum too vast and too subtle to ignore. The first hints of this ultimatum came not from governments, but from individuals. Farmers in South America reported seeing the sky ripple above their fields at night, shimmering waves of light with no earthly explanation. Sailors in the Pacific swore that compasses spun wildly and radios crackled with faint, alien tones whenever they sailed beyond certain coordinates. In Siberia, entire villages reported waking to find the night sky filled with pulsing orbs that aligned perfectly with the position of the fleet overhead. These were not official transmissions, not broadcasts like the ones before. They were silent displays, reminders, demonstrations, hints, and though they carried no words, their meanings seeped into the global consciousness. We are here, we have not left, we are waiting for your answer. But what was the question? That uncertainty was the true weapon of the silence. Governments scrambled to interpret the displays, convening secret councils of scientists, philosophers, linguists, and theologians. Some argued the fleet demanded restraint, that humanity should stop tampering with the blueprints until it was ready. Others insisted the opposite, that the fleet was daring us to prove ourselves, to build, to ascend, to show we could wield the knowledge without collapsing into chaos. The lack of clarity was the cruelty of it. Every faction projected its hopes and fears onto the silence, and every interpretation deepened the divide. One incident in Africa sharpened the debate into something darker. A coalition of rogue engineers had built a crude version of one of the blueprint machines in an abandoned desert facility. The device was unstable, but it functioned long enough to generate a field of energy that lit the sky with unnatural colors. For 6 hours, it hummed, glowing like a beacon. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it collapsed, imploding into a crater that swallowed the entire facility. Witnesses described seeing lights above, not satellites or meteors, but luminous shapes aligned with the fleet. The implication was unmistakable. The machine had been erased, not by human hands, but by something watching from above. From that day, the phrase "the silent ultimatum" entered public vocabulary. It became shorthand for the idea that the fleet was not asking, but demanding something of us. Though what exactly that was remained beyond reach, fear spread faster than facts. In cities around the world, murals and graffiti painted the ultimatum in grim strokes, alien eyes staring from the sky, captions warning, "Choose or they wait." Protesters filled streets, chanting for governments to cease all blueprint research. declaring that any attempt to build would bring catastrophe. At the same time, rival groups insisted the only way forward was to complete the test, to prove to the fleet that humanity was worthy. Skirmishes broke out between the two factions, sometimes violent, always heated. What had begun as scientific debate now spilled into civil unrest, even war in some regions. The ultimatum was no longer a metaphor. It was a dividing line carving humanity in two. In the corridors of power, the ultimatum became a weapon for manipulation. Politicians used it to justify crackdowns, claiming to protect citizens from angering the fleet. Militaries invoked it to seize control of research, declaring that only they had the discipline to face the test. Corporations exploited it, promising safety or salvation in exchange for money and loyalty. And beneath it all, intelligence agencies traded rumors like currency, whispers of secret experiments that had succeeded, of devices hidden in mountains, of alien responses more direct than anyone dared admit publicly. Truth and lies blurred until no one could separate them, and the silence of the fleet became a canvas on which every fear, every ambition, every prophecy was painted. The psychological strain was immense. For the first time in history, humanity felt not just watched, but judged. Every action measured against a standard it could not understand. Religions surged as people searched for answers. Old faiths revitalized with new interpretations of the fleet as angels, demons, or gods. At the same time, new cults rose, declaring the ultimatum as revelation, some urging surrender, others calling for defiance. In cities, people gathered nightly to stare at the sky, waiting for signs, convinced the silence would break for them alone. And in darker corners, despair spread. Suicides rose, fueled by the belief that the ultimatum was not a test, but a sentence already passed. The most disturbing shift came when the silence began to feel targeted. In South Korea, every attempt to replicate the blueprints ended in disaster, while in Brazil, similar attempts were ignored, allowed to proceed longer before failing. Some scientists suggested the fleet was not punishing randomly, but selectively, perhaps testing different groups in different ways. If true, then the ultimatum was not a single command, but a tailored challenge, adapted to each culture, each decision, each failure. Humanity was not facing one question, but many, and each answer might shape how the fleet judged us. Theories multiplied. Some argued the fleet was offering us a choice between restraint and ambition, peace and progress, survival and extinction. Others believed the ultimatum was simpler: unity or collapse. The broadcasts had shown us our own history, our voices, our failure. Perhaps the ultimatum was not about the machines at all, but about whether humanity could come together, set aside fear and rivalry, and act as one. But if that was the test, then humanity was failing spectacularly. Every nation, every faction, every individual pulled in a different direction, and the silence only deepened the division. As the year wore on, strange anomalies grew more frequent. Entire regions experienced blackouts with no explanation. Rivers reversed flow for minutes at a time. The magnetic poles pulsed violently, disrupting navigation worldwide. Each event coincided with moments of heightened debate about the blueprints, as though the fleet were punctuating our arguments with demonstrations of its reach. The ultimatum no longer felt abstract. It was inscribed into the physical world itself. Humanity had no choice but to acknowledge it. And yet, the most chilling realization was that silence itself was the message. The fleet had no need to speak again. By withholding clarity, it forced humanity to reveal itself, to show its instincts when faced with the unknown. Would we unite, or tear ourselves apart? Would we build, or refrain? Would we rise, or collapse? The silence was the test, and the ultimatum was simple. Humanity must choose. But what no one could answer, what no one dared even ask aloud, was the most terrifying question of all. What happens when the choosing is done? If the silence was the ultimatum, then somewhere, somehow, a deadline must exist. And when it comes, the fleet will no longer be silent. In the end, the greatest revelation was not in the broadcasts, the blueprints, or the sabotage, but in the mirror the fleet had held up to us. For centuries, humanity had gazed into the night sky and wondered whether it was alone. Now we had our answer, and it was not the comforting truth of kindred spirits welcoming us into a cosmic family, nor the terrifying certainty of conquerors descending to enslave us. It was something far more complex and far more unsettling. We were being observed, tested, weighed against a standard we could neither see nor understand. The fleet had never offered explanations, never spoken in words we could mistake for guidance. It had only shown us ourselves, our biology, our planet, our history, our failures, and then it had waited in silence, as if the outcome mattered less to them than to us. The silence was the true message. It stripped away excuses, forcing us to confront our divisions, our ambitions, our capacity for unity and destruction. Every attempt to act was met with consequence, sometimes subtle, sometimes catastrophic. And in those consequences, we glimpsed the possibility that the test was not about machines or power, but about choice. Would we tear ourselves apart, chasing gifts we weren't ready for? Or would we find a way to step forward together? The irony was cruel. In revealing the cosmos to be alive with intelligence, the fleet had forced us to realize how fragile our own intelligence truly was. We were brilliant enough to dream of wielding alien knowledge, yet fractured enough to weaponize it against each other before it even existed. In every corner of the world, humanity responded in its own way. Some chose faith, seeing the fleet as divine messengers, angels or demons cloaked in metal and silence. Others chose defiance, vowing to build, to ascend, to seize the knowledge no matter the cost. Still others chose despair, convinced the ultimatum was not a test, but a sentence, and that the silence meant judgment already passed. But whether through faith, ambition, or despair, humanity revealed itself, and that perhaps was the only answer the fleet had ever wanted. As years passed, the objects continued to drift, unchanging, their presence a constant in the sky. Children grew up never knowing a world where the stars were simply stars. Every decision, every conflict, every hope was colored by the awareness that we were no longer alone, and that somewhere in that silence, someone was watching. The test had no visible clock, no explicit rules, yet everyone felt the weight of time pressing down. At any moment the silence could end again, and when it did, the verdict, whatever it was, would arrive. Perhaps that was the point. The fleet didn't need to act. It didn't need to destroy us or uplift us. It only needed to hold the mirror steady, to let us see what we became when faced with the unknown. In that way, the fleet had already won, because it had changed us forever. The question of are we alone was gone, replaced with a harder one, are we ready? And as humanity stumbled forward, fractured but aware, hopeful yet afraid, the answer remained uncertain. The silence still waits, vast and unbroken. And somewhere above, beyond the reach of our doubts and divisions, the fleet remains.